Good morning, guys. My name is Dr. Christensen, and I teach advanced physiology here at Lamar University. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about oxygen transport in the blood. To know how oxygen is transported in the blood, first you have to get familiar with the blood itself. In an adult human, there's about 5 liters of blood circulating throughout the system at any given time. 60% or so of that blood is what's known as plasma, which is a watery substance that contains proteins, fats, and sugars. And then the other 40% contains white blood cells for use in the immune system, platelets for clotting, and of course, red blood cells. What are you doing here? Sorry guys, that's my cat Swiffer. He likes to interrupt. Swiffer, what are you doing down here? Come here, buddy. Sorry about that, guys. But back to what I was saying. Red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, are the primary oxygen transport cells in the blood. They're shaped kind of like a donut if a donut didn't have a hole all the way through and instead it was just an indentation, like this. Just a nice circular donut shape. Ignore the little dent there. It's supposed to be a circle. I'm not an artist, I'm sorry. And remember, the middle isn't a hole. It's more like a little cavity in there, a little scooped out part. And then this would be the side view, essentially. And the shape of the red blood cell is what allows for more oxygen to diffuse or move into and spread out in the cell. This increased amount of surface area, as opposed to just a regular circle, is going to optimize the oxygen transport process. Myself, I can't do all the donuts. I can't do all the sweets and all that. I'd rather experience the sweet high of waking up in the morning and just going for a run. Anyways, mature red blood cells are a bit different from average cells because they don't have a nucleus or many organelles. Because they lack this nucleus and ribosomes, they're not able to reproduce on their own or to make new proteins. They also lack a mitochondria, which means they have to get their energy through anaerobic respiration. I see a hand. What you got, Aziz?
Yes, Dr. Christensen. I just wanted to clarify. Isn't the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell in the same way that I'm the powerhouse of the gym?
Yes, Aziz, that's absolutely correct. And on that note, it's time for me to pass this lecture on to our next guest speaker. Everyone, please help me in welcoming a well-known colleague of mine, Dr. Terry. Thank you for the warm welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Terry. I apologize for the state of my appearance this morning. I was on an expedition and I encountered a carnivorous Venus flytrap. That would account for the unsightly state of my normally neat white hair. To continue with what Dr. Christensen was saying, red blood cells get their energy from anaerobic respiration to transport their oxygen load to areas in need. Because there are so few organelles in a blood cell, and because of the structural proteins in a red blood cell, known as actin and spectrin, the cell is able to bend its shape more freely to squeeze through tight spaces. The lack of organelles also allows more room for hemoglobin, this being the protein in the red blood cells that is responsible for the reversible binding to oxygen molecules. This protein functions for the oxygen transport process due to its 4 subunits, 2 alpha and 2 beta. Oh, my marker's not working too well there. You get the point. Polypeptide chains that makes up what is known as the globin. Each polypeptide chain is subsequently bound to a red pigment molecule known as heme. Together, the heme and the globin form, as you may have guessed, hemoglobin. Heme is not a protein, but is instead a compound that contains ferrous iron in its center. The heme functions by binding oxygen molecules that have diffused through the membrane of the red blood cell. Since one red blood cell can hold upwards of 250 million hemoglobin molecules, this makes for a lot of oxygen being transported by these cells. It's also important to keep these hemoglobin levels constant in the body so that the body can maintain its normal functions. Without constant levels being kept to ensure accurate bodily functions, blood disorders like anemia, which is characterized by low hemoglobin levels, or erythrocytosis, which is characterized by high hemoglobin levels, can develop. You know, all this talk about blood and disorders makes me miss the peaceful and charming world of botany, where nothing ever goes wrong. Oh yes, feel free to take over from me now. Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Pine and I teach a course here at Lamar known as Limnology, which is the study of continental waters and the organisms that inhabit them, like fish. But today I'm assisting with this lecture, so get ready for a ride on the red blood cell rapids. Like Dr. Terry was saying, oxygen binds with the iron found in the heme. Each time oxygen binds, it alters the shape of the hemoglobin protein, making it easier for the next oxygen to bind, and the next oxygen to bind, and the next oxygen to bind, so on and so forth until the hemoglobin is maxed out on oxygen. This increase in the oxygen's affinity for hemoglobin with each added oxygen molecule is known as positive cooperative binding, and the hemoglobin that carries its maximum capacity of oxygen is known as oxyhemoglobin. The oxygen binding to iron can be reversed depending on the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Whoa! I'll take over from here. My name's Dr. Hoke, and my hair is better than yours. Now that that's out of the way, let's continue. Oxygen begins its binding process in the lungs, where there is a high partial pressure of oxygen. As the blood travels from the heart and reaches the lungs, the oxygen there enters the bloodstream via tiny sacs in the lungs called alveoli, and then diffuses across the surface of the red blood cells, where it cooperatively binds with the heme, located within the hemoglobin. The red blood cells are saturated with oxygen, and the hemoglobin within is now oxyhemoglobin. From the lungs, the elastic red blood cells travel along arteries, squeeze through the tiny capillaries, and finally arrive at the cells of the tissues, where there is a low partial pressure of oxygen. Here, the oxygen diffuses along the concentration gradient and moves into the tissue cells. While hemoglobin is depositing the oxygen in the tissue, it simultaneously collects carbon dioxide from the tissue cells, which then binds to the polypeptides in the hemoglobin. As the CO2 binds to the hemoglobin, its structure changes and decreases the oxygen's affinity for the hemoglobin. This is what allows the oxygen to be released and to travel into the tissue. The competition for binding space on the hemoglobin between the oxygen and carbon dioxide based on their relative partial pressures in the lungs and the tissue is what drives the process. Oxygen has a high partial pressure in the lungs and a low partial pressure in the tissue. Carbon dioxide has a low partial pressure in the lungs and a high partial pressure in the tissue. These pressures make oxygen binding more favorable in the lungs and CO2 binding more favorable in the tissue. As one molecule type binds to the hemoglobin, the other is released. And with that, I'm out. Here's Dr. Yoder. Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Yoder and I teach embryology, which is the study of embryos and eggs and fetal development and the like. To continue where Dr. Hope left off, the CO2 that travels in the blood is mainly in the form of bicarbonate ions, seen here and here. In the tissues where carbon dioxide binding is favorable, the following events occur. Within the red blood cells, carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, with the help of an enzyme catalyst known as carbonic anhydrase. The bicarbonate ions diffuse out of the cell to join the other bicarbonate ions in the blood, and its chloride ions flow into the cell to take the place of the bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions that were produced from dissociation bind to the area in the hemoglobin that has released oxygen. As red blood cells find their way back to the lungs, this process happens in reverse. The high oxygen pressure in the lungs makes oxygen more favorable, and the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin and replaces the hydrogen ions. Furthermore, the carbonic anhydrase, as seen in the previous process, converts the hydrogen and bicarbonate ions back into carbon dioxide and water. The CO2 is then released from the hemoglobin to be breathed out by the lungs. And this concludes the process of breathing and oxygen transport by the blood.